Deuteronomy 7 is a pivotal chapter in the Old Testament. It outlines God's commands to the Israelites as they prepare to enter the Promised Land. These instructions were given through Moses. They were meant to guide the Israelites on how to live in their new home. The commands in this chapter are both strict and profound. The Israelites had been wandering in the desert for 40 years. They were about to face formidable nations. These nations were strong in both military and cultural influence. The relevance of Deuteronomy 7 extends beyond ancient Israel. It speaks to modern-day believers about the importance of holiness. It emphasizes obedience to God and the rejection of sinful influences. This chapter is a timeless reminder of God's unchanging principles. God commanded the Israelites to conquer and utterly destroy the nations inhabiting the Promised Land. This command might seem harsh to modern sensibilities, however, it had a specific purpose. The nations occupying the land were deeply entrenched in idolatry and wicked practices. Their influence could corrupt the Israelites' faith. The command to destroy these nations was about more than just physical conquest. It was a spiritual mandate. God wanted to protect his people from the temptations and sins of the pagan cultures. By removing these influences, the Israelites could focus on worshipping God alone. The destruction of these nations was a form of divine justice. These peoples had long been engaged in practices that were abhorrent to God. Their judgment was not arbitrary, but a consequence of their own choices. One of the explicit commands in Deuteronomy 7 is the prohibition of intermarriage with the pagan nations. God was very clear on this point. The Israelites were not to marry the sons and daughters of the people they were conquering. This prohibition was not about ethnic purity, but spiritual purity. Intermarriage with the pagan nations posed a significant risk. It could lead to the Israelites adopting pagan practices and forsaking their covenant with God. The influence of a spouse could sway an individual away from their faith. This was a real and present danger in a time when religious practices were closely tied to daily life. The purpose of this prohibition was to maintain the spiritual integrity of the Israelite community. By avoiding intermarriage, the Israelites could stay true to their faith. They could avoid the subtle but powerful influence of pagan religions. This command was a protective measure for their spiritual well-being. Deuteronomy 7 also commands the Israelites to break down pagan altars and idols. This was a direct attack on the physical symbols of pagan worship. God wanted his people to dismantle the structures that represented false gods. This act was more than just physical destruction. It was a declaration of allegiance to the one true God. The altars and idols of the pagan nations were often placed in prominent locations. They were central to the religious and cultural life of these societies. By destroying them, the Israelites were making a powerful statement. They were rejecting the false gods and asserting the supremacy of their God. This command highlights the need for believers to remove all forms of idolatry from their lives. Idolatry can take many forms, not just physical idols. Anything that takes the place of God in our hearts can become an idol. Section 5. God's choice of the Israelites and his love for them. In Deuteronomy 7, God reminds the Israelites of their special status. He chose them not because of their numbers or strength, but because of his love and his promise to their ancestors. This divine choice was an act of grace. It was a testament to God's faithfulness and love. God's choice of the Israelites was a part of his larger plan. He intended to use them as a light to the nations. Their obedience and holiness were to serve as a witness to the surrounding peoples. God's love for the Israelites was not based on their merit, but on his sovereign will and purpose. This assurance of God's love is crucial. It provided the Israelites with a sense of identity and purpose. They were chosen to be a holy people, set apart for God's service. Section 6. The Covenant and the Blessings of Obedience. Deuteronomy 7 emphasizes the covenant between God and the Israelites. This covenant was a binding agreement. It required the Israelites to obey God's commands fully. In return, God promised to bless them abundantly. The blessings included prosperity, health, and protection from their enemies. Obedience to God's commands was the key to experiencing these blessings. The covenant was not just a legal contract, but a relational agreement. It was based on love, trust, and faithfulness. God's promises were sure, but they required the Israelites to walk in obedience. The blessings of the covenant were tangible and comprehensive. They affected every area of the Israelites' lives. Section 7. Consequences of disobedience and rejection of God. Deuteronomy 7 also warns of the consequences of disobedience and rejection of God. These consequences were severe. They included defeat by enemies, loss of God's protection, and suffering. The stakes were high because the Israelites' obedience was tied to their survival and success. Disobedience to God's commands was seen as a breach of the covenant. It was a rejection of God's authority and love. This breach had serious repercussions. It opened the door to the very influences and dangers that God sought to protect them from. The consequences served as a stark warning to take God's commands seriously. The concept of divine justice is evident here. God's commands were not just arbitrary rules. They were designed for the well-being of his people. Disobedience led to natural and spiritual consequences. Section 8, relating ancient instructions to modern spiritual practices. The instructions in Deuteronomy 7 might seem distant and ancient. However, their principles are highly relevant today. The call to holiness, obedience, and rejection of idolatry is timeless. These principles guide our spiritual practices and shape our relationship with God. Modern believers can relate to the need for spiritual purity. In a world filled with distractions and temptations, the call to remain focused on God is crucial. Just as the Israelites were to avoid pagan influences, we are to avoid anything that draws us away from God. This requires vigilance and intentionality. The concept of breaking down idols is also relevant. Today, idols might not be physical statues, but they can be anything that takes precedence over God in our lives. This could be money, career, relationships, or even personal ambitions. Section 9. The significance of holiness in today's world. Holiness is a key theme in Deuteronomy 7. It is as significant today as it was for the Israelites. Holiness means being set apart for God. It involves living in a way that reflects God's character and values. This call to holiness is a defining aspect of the Christian life. In today's world, the concept of holiness can be challenging. Society often promotes values that are contrary to God's standards. However, the call to holiness requires us to stand firm in our faith. It requires us to be different, to be a light in the darkness. Holiness affects every aspect of our lives. It influences our choices, behaviors, and relationships. Section 10, concluding thoughts on spiritual purity and faithfulness. As we conclude our exploration of Deuteronomy 7, the importance of spiritual purity and faithfulness stands out. God's commands to the Israelites were clear and uncompromising. They were designed to protect and bless his people. These commands are relevant to us today as we navigate our spiritual journeys. Spiritual purity involves removing anything that hinders our relationship with God. It requires us to identify and tear down the idols in our lives. This process is ongoing and requires diligence and dedication. Purity is not just about avoiding wrong, but wholeheartedly pursuing what is right. Faithfulness to God is essential. It involves obedience to his commands and trust in his promises. This faithfulness is a testament to our love and commitment to God. It is the foundation of a vibrant and fulfilling spiritual life. In a world filled with distractions and challenges, the call to holiness and faithfulness is more important than ever.